The Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. And it's actually the youngest brother, a shepherd boy, who was not even considered worthy enough to be brought before Samuel, that the Lord chooses. That's King David. So, maybe it's not you who has disqualified yourself. Maybe others around you have disqualified you. I want you to take courage because the Lord holds a different set of criteria than we do. And what He has set forth to do, no one is going to be able to stop. Hey there! Are you a Christian woman who's ready to strengthen your faith and stop the madness in your mind? The worry, doubt, anxiety. Do you want something more for your life but are not sure where to even begin? You've come to the right place. Hi, I'm Kristin Campbell. I'm excited that you're here as we journey together to discover mindset renewal and empowered faith for the Christian woman. We disqualify ourselves from fulfilling God's plan for our life. God doesn't. We do. It's time to change this. It's time to see ourselves from God's perspective. And I want to take a look at a really great example for us to learn from. I want to look at Sarah's story. Now, her story is pretty famous. I mean, children in the earliest Sunday school classes hear about how God blessed her with a son, even though she was 100 years old. And this is fulfilling God's promise to make Abraham, her husband, the father of nations. And she's also listed in Hebrews 11 among several names of those being honored for their faith. Hebrews 11 is sometimes referred to as the Hall of Faith chapter. And it tells us that Sarah is there because, according to verse 11, she considered God, who had given her the promise, to be reliable, trustworthy, and true to His word. I mean, wow. It's really awesome. And it paints this wonderful picture that God gives a promise, she believes, she gives birth, and happily ever after. Yet, have you taken a closer look at her story? Because there's quite a bit that goes on between God giving the promise to Abraham and the promise being fulfilled that's left out of her Sunday school version. And it's important to know not to compare ourselves against Sarah, but to learn from her experience, her choices, and ultimately her faith. So let's look at the more detailed, accurate story beginning in Genesis 15. So in Genesis 15, we have Abram. His name hasn't been changed yet. And he's reminding the Lord that he has no child of his own. And he's really concerned because that means that a servant born in his house is going to become his heir. That was just the law of the time. So he's concerned because everything that he owns, everything that he's worked for is going to go to basically another family. The Lord tells Abram that's not going to be the case. But he who shall come from your own body will be your heir. And in verse 6, it tells us that Abram believed the Lord. So I have to assume that he goes back and he tells his wife what the Lord has said. Now, Sarai, who's Sarah, her name hasn't been changed yet, she realizes that she hasn't borne him any children. She's in her 80s at this point. So she's recognizing that she is past childbearing age. So she decides she's going to help bring God's promise about. She has a maidservant named Hagar. And Sarai tells Abram to go lie with Hagar, and maybe that's how the promised heir is going to come about. Because again, in those days, this was legal to do. So Abram agrees. Hagar does become pregnant. And lo and behold, tensions rise between Sarai and Hagar, as you can imagine. So Sarai begins to abuse Hagar. She resents her. And the Lord has his own encounter with Hagar. He blesses her, and Ishmael is born. 13 years later, just think about that. 13 years later, the Lord appears to Abram again. At this point, he changes his name to Abraham. He redeclares his original promise to make Abraham a father of nations. And this time, he clarifies that it's going to be through Sarah. He's changed her name to Sarah at this point. Abraham laughs because he's 100 years old. Sarah is 99 years old at this point. So Abraham offers up Ishmael again as the solution. And the Lord says, no, Sarah will bear you a son, Isaac. And the covenant is going to be fulfilled through Isaac and his descendants. So now we have a little bit more clarity. It's like God kind of had to spell it out. It's actually going to be through your legitimate wife that this is going to happen. So we're told that sometime later, the Lord appears again. And this time, when he tells Abraham, when he redeclares it, he says it's going to be within a year. So this time, when he's telling Abraham this, Sarah actually overhears. So she hears it for the first time from the Lord's mouth herself. And she laughs. And the Lord asks, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Well, then Sarah kind of freaks out and she lies and says, oh, I didn't laugh. But the Lord said, no, but you did. And, I think this is something that we all would have done. Well, sure enough, Isaac was born that same time the following year. And now the rest is history. So that more detailed story paints a different picture than the Sunday school version. And we need to really learn from this because we all make similar choices as Sarah did. Perhaps not in that specific context, but we've had the same motivations and the same mindsets that she had. So let's look at this. First of all, she disqualified herself as being part of God's promise. Even though she was Abram's wife, she saw herself as unable to be used by God. She took herself out of the plan completely. And her reasoning was her old age and her history of not being able to conceive. Now, we can look at her and be like, oh, that was a mistake. God's going to give you Isaac. But really, we can only say that because we have a written account of how her story ends. She didn't know that at the time. She acted as we all would have. She acted based on what she knew, what she understood, her own perception. And I want you to think about this. What do you use as a disqualifier for yourself based on your own understanding, based on your own perceptions? I'm too old. I'm divorced. I'm not educated enough. Ugh, I've lied so much in the past. I have a record. But I'm a former drug addict, prostitute, witch. I'm estranged from my family. I don't have a home church. I'm a single mom. I've never been able to succeed in the past. This list of disqualifiers can go on and on because we all at times have found reasons to disqualify ourselves from the promises of God, to disqualify ourselves from the dreams that He's placed in our hearts. because we look at ourselves and we look at our circumstances and we look at it through human eyes. 1 Samuel 16:7. This is where Samuel is looking to anoint one of Jesse's sons as king, as directed by the Lord. And he's looking at all the older sons, and they all appear to be really good choices. Yet the Lord denies them. And in verse 7, he tells Samuel, "The Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart." And it's actually the youngest brother, a shepherd boy, who was not even considered worthy enough to be brought before Samuel, that the Lord chooses. That's King David. So, maybe it's not you who has disqualified yourself. Maybe others around you have disqualified you. I want you to take courage, because the Lord holds a different set of criteria than we do. And what he has set forth to do, no one is going to be able to stop. Another lesson that we can learn from Sarah pertains to her decision to bring about God's promise in a way that she understood. So first, she disqualifies herself, and then she comes up with her own plan. And I don't believe it was sneaky or deceitful. I believe she was really trying to help. Because, have you ever tried to help God along? I have. When I couldn't really see or understand what he was speaking to me, I would tweak it to be what I could understand, to be what I knew to be possible. So Sarah does the same thing. She gives Hagar as a reasonable solution. Yet it wasn't God's plan. And deep within, she knows it, because it tells us that she resents Hagar and actually ends up abusing her. And it's really sad. Yet I think, again, we can all relate, because when we try to manipulate God's plan, we know something's not right. We can sense the turmoil within ourselves. And that turmoil, it's going to find a way out. In Sarah's case, it came out by abusing Hagar and resenting her. Isaiah 55 tells us God's ways are not our ways. We need to be willing to embrace the mystery of God. We will never fully know or understand God or his plans. We just won't. Yet, if we can see it, if we can recognize it, there truly is beauty and peace in embracing, in trusting the mystery of the Lord, trusting in his greater ways. And it's easy to say, but it's really challenging to live out day to day. And yet, Sarah gives us a glimpse into how to make that happen as well. So if you remember, when Sarah overheard that she would bear a son, she laughed, because the idea was so outrageous. It was so beyond anything she had ever really conceived in her mind. And the automatic response was laughter. That's just crazy talk. And yet when the Lord calls her out, she's very afraid and she lies. Again, I think that's just an automatic response, because I'm sure she thought, oh no, he's serious. I just laughed, but he's for real. And I got to be honest, I can relate here too, and I'm sure you can. Have you ever had a moment where you hear from the Lord or you feel prompted and you kind of blow it off because it's just crazy talk, only to have it come back stronger later? That's where you think, oh, he really did say that. And now you have to adjust yourself to get into a position to obey. And that's what's happening here. The thought that she would give birth at 100 years old, after all the years of trying, all the shame, all the longing, all the sorrow of not having a child, all the years of dreaming, and then all the years spent really coming to terms that she was barren. Yet now she's going to give birth? I mean, it seemed ludicrous. It seemed out of any realm of possibility. It seemed exactly like a God plan. He's given each of us our own wild, crazy, seemingly impossible plan too. And here's where we really learn from Sarah, from what got her inducted into the Hall of Faith. Do you remember? Hebrews 11:11 in the Amplified. It says, because she considered God, who had given her the promise, to be reliable and trustworthy and true to his word. That's the key. Are you considering only your qualifications or lack thereof? Or are you considering God's qualifications? That he is reliable, he is trustworthy, he is true to his word. Where do you need to readjust how you are seeing your circumstances today? How can you realign your faith to what God has placed in your heart? Because according to Philippians 1:6, he who begins a good work in you will bring it to completion. Have faith. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. I hope you walked away a little stronger in your faith and freer in your mind. You are so loved. If you like this episode, share it with a friend. Leave your ratings and reviews, and engage with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you.